When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we'll be continuing our Song of Ice and Fire reread. We'll be doing our first Jon chapter. I really like this chapter. It's not, you know, one of the most impactful ones, but this one more or less is going to be taking place at the feast for the Baratheons, Lannisters, Starks. This is after Ned won, so now Ned has been offered the position of the Hand of the King. Jon is someone that at this point is just sitting at the end of the feast hall. He's not really anywhere near like the dais where you would kind of see in this image where it'd be kind of like people in the front. And that will lead to really where Jon's going to be going throughout this entire book, as we'll get conversations with Benjen and Tyrion that will really define his character for a long time. So that is kind of the makeup of what is going to start, and we'll kind of start with page 49 and getting into Jon's head. So page 49, it's pretty much just an introduction to kind of what I just said, how this is a feast. But we note here that, like I said, Jon is at the back of the feast. So he's kind of with the young squires, the kind of people that really, like, they're not important enough to be seated very highly up in this feast. They're the people that are like, yes, you have enough credit to be here, but not really enough to where you're important. And that's kind of an interesting idea here, because up until this point, we've known Jon's a bastard and we've seen how people treat him. But even now you would think, okay, well, this is Ned's son, and he's nowhere near where all of Ned's kids are that were presented with instantly. And it's another just one of those things that shows how Catelyn has isolated him, because we learned that this wasn't even Ned's doing. This was actually Catelyn's doing. That Catelyn thought that it would be an insult to the royal family if Jon was up with the rest of her kids. And I don't think that's probably true at all. It's just Catelyn discriminating Jon like she usually does. This is a normal occurrence with her, and it's something we'll kind of realize in the next few chapters as we talk about Jon's future. But Jon also notes that he's actually happy that he's not up there, because Ned is someone that only allows his children to drink 1 cup of wine, no more. And because Jon is so far in the back, he can really do whatever he wants. He can be drinking, and that's kind of what we're kind of told here, is that Jon's been drinking for quite a while, and that he's having a good time. He enjoys the company of the squires and the other people more than he does like the high lords and stuff like that, and they're probably much more dull. So page 50 kind of begins with a lot of our introductions. So very differently from the show, right? Where in the show we kind of jump into everyone sitting down, the feast already happening. In the book, we see how Jon's very observant, right? They all kind of come in pairs, right? So before we kind of get into that, like I had noted, we get more information here that Jon really has been drinking unsupervised for 4 hours. Now, I want to bring this up because it doesn't maybe seem like a huge point, but when we get to later in this chapter, right, and we understand how drunk Jon is, this is the first time that he's been this drunk. So if you are someone that, you know, has drank before and you've drank a lot, think about the first time you really went overboard. That's where Jon is at this moment, right? So that also goes to show how observant he is, even when he is impaired. But 2, when we have some of these deep conversations that are very important to Jon's life, like decisions like going to the wall, I want you to think about it. He's not making those decisions while being sober and having full consciousness. That's very important to understand. So, like we talked about before I went into that little idea, all of the royal family and the Starks are kind of coming in together, right? So we have Ned and Cersei there kind of in arm, and they come in. And Jon right away kind of notices that Ned doesn't really look very happy, uneasy almost. And we learn about that a little bit more when Benjen sits down. But we know that's because of what he just got offered with the Hand of the King thing. But Cersei comes in, and Jon notes how beautiful she is, kind of the normal thing everybody talks about with Cersei. But also, he notices that there's something missing behind her. Like, that's the little smile she has, that she doesn't really want to be here. That she's kind of a little pissed off, a little angry. And that's mainly for a lot of reasons. That 1, she doesn't really like the North. 2, you have the stuff with Robert that happened in the last chapter with Ned. There's a lot of things that happen in the last couple of chapters that would make Cersei kind of angry. So it's interesting that Jon is able to pick up on all of these things while a lot of his half brothers or half sisters are not able to do those things. Now, after them follows Robert and Catelyn, and this is kind of the most disappointing part for Jon, where Jon has heard stories about Robert Baratheon, the demon on the trident, and this is not the same guy. It's an overweight kind of dude. We talked about all these things in the last chapter, so I'm not going to harp on them, but Robert being overweight, really not this warrior king like person that Jon is thinking a king should be, right? He's not the man of legends. And something else that I want you guys to remember. Jon notes that Ned tells these stories about Robert and the demon of the trident a lot. And that specifically a lot. Now I want you guys to remember that when we get to a chapter later on in the story where Ned has this line. It's the line that, in my opinion, always has been the biggest plot hole of anything in A Song of Ice and Fire, is when Ned says that he never thinks about Rhaegar. He's telling the story of Robert killing Rhaegar a lot, apparently. So just keep that in mind, that there is some discrepancy in that later on. Now, we see the children are now following, and we see here that Jon is very loved by most of the Stark family. We know later on because Arya really likes Jon. We know Robb likes Jon. And here we have this idea that Rickon, this little baby, because remember, he's like 3 years old. He's a little baby kid. He's not very old. He's struggling to get down to where the Starks are sitting, and he stops by Jon, which I think was really cute. It's an interesting scene. And it shows how Jon really is a part of the family. He just isn't treated like one by Catelyn, whereas the rest, everyone really outside of Sansa, treats him like a brother. So that was an interesting part. Now, this is another very interesting part that builds Jon and Robb's relationship from Jon's side of it anyway, is that when Robb and Myrcella come through, Jon kind of believes Myrcella is kind of a fool, kind of in the way he describes it. And Robb can't really see it because Jon sees that Myrcella is obviously attracted and nervous around Robb. And I think we see Jon's jealousy here because think about it. This is one of the royal children, someone that is very, important, is very much head over heels for Robb. And Jon, I think, just has that little jealousy towards Robb because Robb is Robb the Lord. He's the person going to inherit Winterfell. He's looked upon fondly by all the girls and all these things. There's a little bit of Jon's jealousy leaking out that, Jon likes Robb, of course, and they're like brothers, but it's a little bit of that brotherly jealousy, and also Jon being a bastard, that he doesn't experience those same things that Robb does experience. I thought that was a little interesting note to point out. So page 51, we will continue with the rest of the children and more of the feast things. So page 51 continues with Arya and Sansa being led by Tommen and Joffrey. And what's interesting to see here is how tall Joffrey is. This is something I think they missed on the show with just because of how casting went with Richard Madden and Kit Harington kind of being older. Them being older and significantly older than Jack Gleason, it kind of showed like you never really got that aspect of the books, where the books, it's actually said that Joffrey is like significantly taller than both Robb and Jon, which is even more interesting because Robb and Jon are actually 14 while Joffrey is 12. So it's interesting to note there that also you would have that kind of jealousy of Joffrey being more physically tall in stature over Robb and Jon. And also Jon already dislikes Joffrey, and I think it's for a couple reasons here. One is that Joffrey kind of looks the part. There's that certain thing where guys, I feel like, tend to see other guys and just not like them just based off of physical appearance. And that's kind of how Joffrey's described as. He's kind of described as having like the pouty lips, being like a very, how would I put this? But like a clean guy, I guess, and Jon just doesn't like him right away. Maybe that's jealousy. Maybe that's some of the physical features that we see already, because Joffrey and Jon have not really had any interaction, but we again see another character that doubts Joffrey being a decent guy. And another thing that is major foreshadowing in this page is that Joffrey is only described by his Lannister traits. There's no comparison to the the Baratheon traits here. It's all of the Lannister traits. His hair and being, blonde, and his eyes being the eyes of the Lannisters. No mention of any Baratheon traits, just a little bit of subtle foreshadowing this early in the book. But Jon, after all these characters have left, is way more interested in the arrival of Jaime and Tyrion. Jon is kind of awestruck by Jaime. Jaime is this splendid knight. He's tall, handsome, and he's one of the best swordsmen in all of Westeros. And Jon even notes that this is what a king should look like. Now, we can note here that maybe this line was put in here because in George R. R. Martin's original, chapters, there was this idea that Jaime eventually becomes king and all of that. And I'm not going to go too far into it. There's videos on that other stuff if you guys would like to look them up. But more or less, Jaime becomes king. Was this a line that maybe George put in there? Probably. But it is interesting to show how it's interesting that Jon has this idea of what a king should be based upon their physical traits and how they look as a warrior. It very much is comparable to a line that Renly will utter later on, where he's like, "Do good soldiers make good kings?" That's an interesting idea, and it's something that Jon has to think about, and George R. R. Martin plays on very early on. And if you really pay attention to Jon's descriptions of Joffrey and Jaime, they are described nearly the same. They're described as being tall, having the blonde hair, their eyes. Everything is the same. So again, more foreshadowing by George as to what is to come. We learn now that Jaime is known as the Kingslayer. We've kind of heard this before in other chapters with Viserys, or with Dany 1 and how Viserys talks about Jaime. So we kind of knew this already, but we now kind of put the title to the person. And then all this ends when we get to Tyrion walking in. Now, Tyrion is described quite literally the opposite. He is ugly, stunted, he has different hair color, has different color eyes. His hair is so blonde it is nearly white, which begs the question, is it Targaryen hair? Was the Mad King actually Tyrion's father? Something that I think a lot of people point to is that white hair, or nearly white hair, and the different color eyes. His head is too big. He is everything that Jaime and Cersei are not, where they are tall and beautiful and have all of these physical traits. Tyrion does not. And lastly, we see Benjen and Theon also arrive. Now, again, we see that Benjen is nice to Jon, and is the only one kind of besides Rickon to even notice him. Theon purposely doesn't even look at Jon, like he's not even there. And that's something that in the show they didn't really do that well, where Theon and Jon aren't enemies or people that don't like each other. In the show, it's much more like, they're okay with each other. In the books, it's not like that at all, which is interesting because when we hopefully see the two interact once again in the books, it should be an interesting meeting. And I also think this kind of shows, again, how Theon believes he's just above people, where he believes he's above Jon because he is a bastard. And that just goes, again, into building Theon's character without having to have a Theon POV or a major focus on Theon as a character. And the page kind of ends with Jon giving Ghost some chicken under the table. So Ghost has kind of been sitting under his feet, and he just goes, boom, give me the chicken. Boom, right under the table. And that will lead us into page 52. Now, page 52 starts with this idea again that Jon, being a bastard, gives him certain privileges, right? Where people don't care about him as much. People aren't worried about what he's doing or who he's bringing into the hall. And we learn that Ghost is the only direwolf actually allowed in the hall, which is another interesting idea. And I think what is interesting here is that Ghost is a wolf that doesn't make any sound. He doesn't really bark, or he's a quiet wolf, right? Again, a bit of comparison to Jon himself, who during this whole point has been very quiet, observing like Ned is himself. And a dog even tries to steal some of the chicken that Jon had dropped below the table, but Ghost scares it off with just baring his fangs, not having to get vocal, loud, showing his strength, which is something Ned tends to do as well. And the page ends with Benjen arriving at the table and noting how drunk Jon is. And this is really where the page And I think the chapter kind of kicks off, because the next part of this chapter is going to be kind of about talking about the Night's Watch and setting up Jon's story. And what I really think is interesting about page 53 and the pages further on with Benjen and Jon is this idea of, again, these are major topics that are life-changing decisions, and we're talking about them while Jon is blackout drunk. And even Benjen knows this. It's not like Benjen's walking in the situation like, is Jon drunk? Like, it's a very odd situation. And when we find out later that apparently Benjen tells Lewin that Jon wants to go to the wall, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that's something we're going to talk about when we get into Catelyn 2, because there's a lot of mystery and intrigue in that chapter, but it is something that gets set up within this chapter itself. So this page really focuses on how observant Jon has become, and a lot of things I've been talking about with you and inside Jon's head is really what he's telling Benjen. Like, he's basically showing his findings to Benjen. And in this page, we finally learn that Catelyn is the reason he isn't with the rest of the Starks, as he normally is. So that's a big key thing here, is that Jon normally is with the Stark family when they eat, but because of these outsiders, Jon has been shown to the back, I guess. And again, we talked about this a little earlier on in the chapter, but Jon notes that Ned is unusually uneasy and attributes both Ned's feelings and Cersei's to Robert going down to the crypt and whatever happened down there. So Jon doesn't know exactly what happens down there, but he knows it's because of that, which is correct. It shows, again, Jon, his ability to understand what's going on without being there, and because he's able to observe what's going on. And Benjen, it's kind of like an off comment, right? Because I don't think Benjen meant this seriously. Benjen kind of just goes, wow, we could use someone with that observation at the wall, which is very true. Again, we know that the wall is in a bad state, but I don't think Benjen meant it like that. But Jon, being kind of in this drunk state, he suddenly asks for Benjen to bring him with him to the wall and that Ned will listen to him. Now, again, I want to note here, this is someone that is drunk off their ass. We know that because when Jon gets up from this little talk, he nearly falls over and he runs into a serving girl. Okay, so none of what is being said right now. Maybe it has some, grain of truth. It's in his inner dialogue or whatever. That maybe it's in the back of his mind where he has these feelings of not being wanted, where he has nothing to gain here. But he's not thinking this all through, right? Cognizant parts of his brain are not really working because of how drunk he is. If you've ever had friends that, or you yourself have been blackout drunk, you know it's not the best time to make decisions. That's why usually you have someone that's with you to be a driver. People can't drive while drunk. Again, should be a big idea here that this is not the time that Jon should be making decisions like this. Now, Benjen kind of does some backpedaling here. Like, he's trying to reason and rationalize with Jon in this state, which, again, Jon being drunk, this is not the best time to rationalize with someone like that, because A, I'm not even going to remember this conversation, and 2, when you're drunk, you're probably just going to go with what I don't know. So more or less, Benjen's basically like, you don't know what you're giving up, and Jon kind of refutes this, thinking he really has no place here. Like, Robb will become Lord of Winterfell, Sansa will get married, Arya will get married, all these people will go on to do things, but Jon doesn't really have a place. And I kind of disagree with Jon here, because you think about it, Jon could easily rise up to being maybe a commander in the army for Ned, could be someone that becomes like a master of arms. We see how skilled Jon is in that idea. There's a lot of things Jon could do even while being a bastard. And it's something I think Tyrion tries to tell him at the end of this chapter that he could do. And we also note here again that Jon is getting more bold and angry because of the wine. Then Benjen says something that I genuinely don't know why he says this. And this is one of those suspicious lines that, in my opinion, Benjen should know exactly what this is going to do. Maybe Benjen forgets that Jon is a bastard here. Again, because Benjen is probably going to know, or not probably, he is going to know that Jon is either Ned and Ashara's, if you want to go with that theory, or Lyanna and Rhaegar's. Either way, or even if you think something else, Benjen knows that Jon's not actually a bastard, and he's not next to Jon a lot of the time. So maybe in this moment, Benjen just forgets that Jon's a bastard. But when Benjen says that, you know, you should come back to me when you have fathered a few bastards, that is something you do not say to someone that is expressing vulnerability and pain towards being a bastard and how they feel like they have no place. I don't get that. And then also, this is the other thing, right? In the Stark family, having bastards is heavily frowned upon. We see this with Robb and how he asked him to marry Jane Westerling later on. Ned himself doesn't like the fact that he has to do this whole yet a bastard thing. It's very heavily frowned upon. So why is Benjen saying these things? Is it because Benjen forgets who he's kind of talking to? Is it because Benjen wants Jon to get angry and pissed off? And I think understandably, Jon is outraged, he's pissed off, and says he will not father any bastards, and gets up to leave, but makes a fool of himself. He gets up too quickly, he's knocking over stuff, he runs into a serving woman, and also, he's so drunk that he's on the verge of crying. Again, Jon is in a very emotional state, and this is the reaction he has to your conversation, to the conversation with Benjen at the end. How do we get to the point that in Catelyn 2, Benjen tells Lewin, yeah, Jon wants to come to the wall? I don't know. There's some very suspicious things going on with Lewin, Benjen, and Catelyn, in my opinion, and that was one. Now, my other thing to note here is Benjen does nothing in this moment. He just lets Jon make a fool of himself and then doesn't follow after him. It's very weird. Like, you would think that Jon is in such a bad state. Sorry to say, this is the first time he's ever been this drunk, and Benjen's doing nothing. Very interesting. And we end this chapter. As Jon is leaving, Tyrion calls for him and asks if Ghost is a direwolf. And that will lead us into page 56, and really the last little section of this chapter, where we will see two of our most interesting and important characters meet each other for the first time. Now, our first introduction really into Tyrion, right? Because we've seen him through other characters' eyes. This is the first time we're having a conversation with Tyrion. We're really seeing him, where he does a stunt off of the ledge and lands on his feet. Very interesting and awesome way to introduce Tyrion, making him very unique. And he asked to meet Ghost. Now, Ghost is, I feel like, very understandably, like, all freaked out. Jon settles him down, and Tyrion is allowed to pet him. Now, what I think here's weird here, right, is that this does a couple things, right? It shows the connection between the Starks and their wolves. We haven't really seen that up to this point, because, again, Jon, I believe, is the first Jon's the first POV chapter we get from one of the Stark children after they get the direwolves, and this is the first time we really see how they're connected, which is interesting. So we see that for the first time. And two, it kind of hints at the conflict between the Lannisters and the Starks, where Ghost is very uneasy towards Tyrion, and it shows a little bit of that conflict to begin with. Now, again, I think Jon here is trying to show off and trying to, I don't know, just try to assert his dominance over Tyrion, which is a really weird thing to say, because that is what people have done to Jon. And it's Jon showing a little bit of that childish behavior, where we talk about a lot, especially in Bran 1, that Jon is someone that is growing quicker than, say, Robb, for instance, but he's still very much a child. He's only 14. And Jon's like, yeah, Jon says that if he wasn't here, Ghost would rip his throat out. And it's like, Jon, why are we saying that? Like, such a weird thing to say. And again, it kind of goes into what I had talked about before. And we end this page by Tyrion asking if Jon is Ned's bastard, which instantly angers Jon. Again, we just played into this whole idea of Jon not wanting to father a bastard and how he's feeling very insecure and vulnerable to that. And Tyrion kind of poking at that really is the thing that is angering Jon at this point. And it's another idea here that it shows that Tyrion really says the first thing that comes to his head. He's not someone that has the most restraint on his words, and something that will get him into trouble in the future. And that will lead us into our final page. I know we're kind of going by this pretty quickly, but this is a really short chapter. And a lot of the things in this chapter, you can pretty much just summarize. There's certain points in this chapter where not a lot's really happening. But yeah, so we'll get into page 57. And it's interesting that Tyrion notes here that Jon has more of the North in him than any of his siblings, which is very curious. Certain people will take this certain ways. Some people will say it's because, oh, he is Ned and Ashara's, which, again, I don't think it makes as much sense, because when we see that Catelyn, right, when she is with Ned and has children, the Tully genes come out. So maybe with Lyanna, her genes are stronger than the Targaryen genes of Rhaegar. I think that could make a lot of sense as to why Jon has more of the North in him than, say, Ned and Ashara. But we don't know, really, so that could also be true as well. Tyrion also utters, again, one of the best lines in the book. It's something that I think you can apply to your everyday life outside of reading. It's something that is one of Jon's biggest, like, quotes, right? Not even his quote, but it's something that references Jon and Tyrion. This is something that is a common theme for both of these characters. And for one character, I think they take it very positively, and another character at times doesn't take it as well. But Tyrion says, "Never forget what you are, for surely the world will not. Make it your strength, then it can never be your weakness. Armor yourself in it, and will never be used to harm you." And I personally relate a lot to this quote, because if you look at certain things, right? For me, I am a huge nerd. I'm running in a Song of Ice and Fire channel. I'm doing, like, that's something that maybe when I was younger, I would be a little bit more nervous about telling people or something like that, because of, you know, oh, it's nerdy or something. And now I very much am very proud of that. I'd rather be doing that than being in some very negative things. And I think that's a very important quote to self-reflection, is how I look at that quote. Is that understanding who you are as a person and either improving those weaknesses of yourself or just accepting who you are as a person is very important. And I think Tyrion telling that to Jon is something that no one has told him, really, and it's something that I think helps build Jon's character. Now, with that being said, you can go too far with it. Tyrion is a character that plays into the imp role too much at times. It gets him into trouble, into book 3 at his trial. It's an interesting quote that has different meanings for different characters. And I kind of talked about this in my notes, that this is going to define both of these characters throughout the entire story. Now, Jon really doesn't understand this, and he questions Tyrion how he would know about being a bastard. And again, I think this shows how young Jon still is, right? Because when you think about it, Tyrion is this imp character that even Jon, when Jon first sees Tyrion, he instantly thinks, wow, he's ugly, wow, he's deformed, this or that. People don't think that of Jon. People that don't know who Jon is, Jon just looks like an average kid, right? And again, Tyrion knows exactly what I just said. A bastard can be many things. An imp can only be an imp. Again, this is kind of true. Everyone is going to see Tyrion as an imp from the first second they meet him. When people meet Jon, for instance, at the Wall, it's going to be very different, right? A lot of common people are not going to give a shit about Jon being a bastard. But people will, even the common people, will care that Tyrion is an imp. Right? And it also sets up the trial in book 3 when it says that all dwarves are bastards in their father's eyes. Great setup for the trial in book 3. Again, George does a great job of establishing things in book 1 that will affect our big payoffs in either book 2 or book 3. And as Tyrion departs to go back into the Great Hall, Jon notes that for a second, Tyrion looked as tall as a king. And this kind of foreshadows the idea that even a small person can cast a very large shadow. And Tyrion is someone that he may be small, but he's very intelligent. He casts a lot of power. He understands how to use his word choice. And that, I think, is a fantastic way to end this chapter. Now, I think this is our shortest book review, or our chapter review. A lot of reasons for that. This chapter's only 9 pages long. Some of this just has some fluff where it's like we're just reacting to people coming into a room, for instance. And we really don't get a lot of our big dialogue and a lot of our big moments until the back, like, 4 pages of this chapter. So the first 5, like, Jon doesn't even say anything, really. So, yeah, thank you guys for watching. Very strong opening chapter for Jon 1, and I will see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.